Legends say that when a reporter asked Cristiano Ronaldo who is the greatest player of all time, he said, "Me." Not sure if all the Portuguese are like that, hopefully not, but they sure have some things from their history to be proud of. As a matter of fact, I would like to be a Portuguese sailor from 15th century, embarking the ship, going to the unknown, not knowing will I be eaten by the kraken, or killed by the sea, or thirst, or by natives. One had to be devilishly brave for such a thing, and that was all for the glory of Portugal, and for some gold, and a little adventure. Portugal, the westernmost European country, was one of the main players in the European age of discovery and exploration. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal for most of the 15th century took a leading role in finding a way to Asia by sailing south around Africa. In the process, the Portuguese accumulated significant knowledge about navigation and the geography of the Atlantic Ocean. At the beginning of the 16th century, Portugal was the most prosperous nation in the world, thanks to its exploits in navigation, exploration and conquest. It was the first European power to start building a colonial empire and dominated two oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian. The ship that really launched the first phase of Portuguese exploration along the African coast was the Caravel. It appeared around 1450, and its development was based on existing fishing boats. The Caravel was nimble and easier to navigate, with a tonnage of 50 to 160 tons, and with 1 to 3 masts. It had triangular sails that tilted at the angle of 45 degrees to the mast and made better use of the wind. No sailing ship can sail directly against the wind, but the Caravel could move towards the wind by moving in a zigzag fashion and thus indirectly progress in the desired direction. It was also able to float upstream in shallow coastal waters. Limited capacity for cargo and crew was its main drawback, but this did not hinder its success. The limited space for crew and cargo was acceptable at first, because as research ships, their cargo was what was in the explorers' feedback about the new territory. Later, for the needs of trade, it was replaced by the carrack and the galley, which could bring much more profit. Celestial navigation, guided by the position of the sun, was already known in the 13th century. For celestial navigation, the Portuguese, like other Europeans, used Arabic navigation tools such as astrolabe and quadrant, which they made easier and simpler to use. They also made the cross stick or Jacob's stick for measuring the height of the sun and other stars at sea. The Southern Cross became a reference after the arrival of Portuguese navigators in the Southern Hemisphere in 1471, beginning celestial navigation towards that constellation. The problem was that the result varied throughout the year, which required corrections. For this, the Portuguese used astronomical tables, ephemerides, valuable tools for ocean navigation, which were widely used in the 15th century. These tables revolutionized navigation, making it possible to calculate latitude. In addition to exploring the coast, the Portuguese also traveled to the ocean to gather meteorological and oceanographic information. This is how the Madeira and Azores archipelagos, as well as the Sargasso Sea, were discovered. Knowing the patterns and currents of winds, trade winds and oceanic rotations in the Atlantic, as well as the determination of geographic latitude, led to the discovery of the best ocean route back from Africa. Instead of heading north along the coast of Africa, ships counterintuitively headed west, crossing the central Atlantic as far as the geographic width of the Azores. From there they took advantage of the constant favorable winds and currents that rotate clockwise in the northern hemisphere due to the atmospheric circulations, which is the way to Lisbon and allowed the Portuguese to move further and further away from the coast. That maneuver became known as volta do mar, turn from the sea or return from the sea. This maneuver was also used by Christopher Columbus, who, when returning from America and setting sail from the Caribbean, directed his ships first to the north up to the 30 degree of latitude, in order to capture and use the westerly winds that prevail in the belt between 30 and 60 degrees latitude. The lack of this information most likely doomed the expedition of the Vivaldi brothers in the 13th century, who headed to the Canary Islands, which at that time were still unknown to Europeans. Once there, without understanding the Atlantic Gyre and Volta do Mar, they were unable to sail upwind up the African coast to the Strait of Gibraltar and home. The Portuguese successfully exploited the global advantage when it came to shipbuilding, navigation and map-making. Not long after the dawn of the 15th century, Portugal, under the ambitious King João I, turned its sight to Morocco, a Muslim stronghold that it saw as gateway to gold, spices and other vast riches from Africa and beyond. In 1415, a Portuguese fleet crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and captured the heavily fortified Moroccan port of Ceuta, heralding Portugal's arrival on the world stage. In decades to come, João's son, Prince Henry the Navigator, financed numerous expeditions along the west coast of Africa, whose goal was to spread Christianity and gain wealth by trading gold, spices and slaves. Portugal is largely responsible for introducing the slave trade to the Americas, by establishing colonies on previously uninhabited Atlantic African islands that served as collection points for captives and goods. In 1487, on a mission to find the waterway from Portugal to India, Bartolomeu Dias led the first successful sea voyage to the southern tip of Africa, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and sailing for several days before turning back. In 1497 to 1499, Vasco da Gama arrived by sea from Europe to India and proved that Africa can be sailed around. In 1497, Vasco da Gama led 4 ships and nearly 170 crew along the route taken by Bartolomeu Dias, this time turning even more sharply into the South Atlantic to catch the favorable currents needed to pass the Cape of Good Hope. Plagued by hunger, scurvy and other dangers of the journey, they sailed up the east coast of Africa, stopping in Mozambique and other ports in what is now Kenya. With the help of local navigator, da Gama and his ships crossed the Indian Ocean and reached Calcutta, India in May 1498. It was the longest ocean voyage up to that time. The sum of the outbound and return distances is longer than the length of the Earth at the equator. This voyage was the first to connect Europe and Asia via an ocean route, simultaneously connecting the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, paving the way for the age of global imperialism and allowing the Portuguese to establish a long-lasting colonial empire on the route from Africa to Asia. From India, Portuguese ship went further east, reaching the Spice Island of Indonesia in 1512 and China in 1514. A few years later, the Portuguese sailor and navigator Fernão de Magalhães, anglicized as Magellan, proposed the western route to the Spice Islands around the tip of South America. After being rejected by King Manuel I of Portugal, Magellan, like Columbus before him, turned instead to Spain. Magellan died in the Philippines, but one of his ships returned to Spain in 1522, completing the historic effort to circumnavigate the globe and marking the beginning of the end of Portugal's dominance of the seas. What may not be so well known is that although Christopher Columbus was neither born in Portugal nor sponsored by the Portuguese king, he was trained by the Portuguese. Columbus went to Lisbon in 1476 and stayed there for several years, seeking the support of the King of Portugal and collecting nautical and geographical information from sailors returning from the sea. He married a Portuguese woman. he received navigational charts and essential information from his father-in-law, Bartolomeo Perestrel, who was governor of the island of Porto Santo in Madeira. After Columbus's voyages to the New World, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch and English began active exploration and exploitation of newly discovered land in America. Portuguese sailors continued to make important discoveries in this new arena as well. Da Gama's success opened the first waterway to India from Europe, paving the way for a new era of global trade and colonialism. In later expeditions, Da Gama and others established a Portuguese network of trading posts and forts in East Africa and India, using brutal force against local Muslim and Hindu populations when deemed necessary. The port of Lisbon was soon crowded with ships carrying prized spices such as cinnamon, ginger, black pepper and saffron, along with other precious goods. At the beginning of the 16th century, Portugal was the most prosperous nation in the world. According to the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 between Spain and Portugal, a vertical line was drawn through the Atlantic Ocean about 345 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, located off the northwest African coast and controlled by Portugal at that time. Spain claimed all lands west of that line, Portugal to all lands to the east, including the coast of Brazil, which at that time had not yet been officially discovered. Portuguese explorer Pedro Alvarez Cabral officially reached Brazil in 1500, prompting speculation among historians that Portugal actually already knew of its existence from an earlier expedition and used that knowledge to push the treaty borders further west. During the first 2 centuries of colonization, the natives and the Portuguese were constantly at war. In the mid-16th century, sugarcane became Brazil's most important export, while slaves from sub-Saharan Africa were its most important import. In the last decade of the 17th century, sugarcane was replaced by gold as the new mainstay of the colony's economy. At the end of the 1807, the Spanish and Napoleonic forces threatened the security of Portugal, as a result of which Prince Regent João, on behalf of Queen Maria I, moved the royal court from Lisbon to Brazil. After the Spanish War of Independence in 1814, the European courts considered it inappropriate for the head of an old European monarchy to rule in their colony, and they demanded that Queen Maria I and Prince Regent João return to Portugal. In order to justify their stay in Brazil, the royal family proclaimed the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarve in 1815, which created a transatlantic kingdom on 2 continents. As tension between the Portuguese and Brazilians grew, the Portuguese Cortes, led by the new regime after the Liberal Revolution of 1820, attempted to restore Brazil's colonial status. The Brazilians refused to comply with that decision. Prince Pedro supported them in this, declaring independence from Portugal on September 7, 1822. This day is celebrated as Brazil's Independence Day. Brazil today occupies an area of 8.5 million square kilometers and has 214 million inhabitants. The Portuguese were the first to explore the coasts of Africa and South America. They first of the Europeans reached the island of Madagascar as well as New Guinea, which is now part of Indonesia. In 1505, they created their own colony on the island of Sri Lanka. They also created the first European colony in India. In 1557, the Chinese emperor gave them Macau as a reward for their services against pirates in the Chinese seas. It was returned to China only in 1999. They also discovered the Seychelles Islands, as well as the island of St. Helena, where Napoleon was later imprisoned and died. In 1543, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach Japan. In 1506, they tried to block other entrances to the Indian Ocean by conquering territories at the point where the Red Sea and Indian Ocean meet, but they failed to block the Strait of Hormuz. In 1509, they won a naval battle at the port of Diu against an alliance of Muslim states reinforced by ships from Venice, Egypt and Turkey, after which Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean was secured for the next 100 years, while European powers dominated until the end of the World War II. Efforts to colonize and maintain territories scattered all over the coast of Africa and the surrounding islands, Brazil, India and Indian territories such as Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Japan, China, Indonesia and Timor were a challenge for a population of only 1 million people that Portugal had at that time. Combined with constant competition from the Spanish, this led to the need for secrecy about every trade route and every colony. As a consequence, many of the documents that were able to reach other European countries were in fact false documents with false dates and false facts, intended to mislead the possible efforts of any other nation. Portugal is a democratic republic, one of the founding countries of NATO and a member of the European Union since 1986. The existence of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is interesting, which is the oldest political alliance in the known history of the world, and which is still in force. The alliance was signed by the Treaty of Windsor back in 1386 between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Portugal, and continues to this day. Portugal's total gross domestic product, according to the World Bank, is estimated to be $252 billion in 2022, which places it in 47th place in the world. GDP per capita at the same parity is about $24,500, which makes Portugal the 39th richest country in the world by that parameter. It has a similar standard of living to Hungary and Poland. Portugal is the largest producer of cork in the world. The biggest cities are Lisbon, Porto and Braga. A little more than 10 million people live in Portugal, while around 250 million people in the world speak the Portuguese language. Portugal is known for fado music, characterized by sad melodies and lyrics, often about the sea and the life of the poor. The word fado, used for the genre, in translation means destiny, while the name for the music is saudade, an expression that is untranslatable in many languages, something like nostalgia, longing, a feeling of regret for something, a negative emotion that is nevertheless enjoyed. Portugal is famous for its wines, cheeses, as well as its cuisine based on fish, mostly cod, for which there are countless recipes. A pastry with egg cream sprinkled with cinnamon if desired is also known, the so-called pastel de nata, which was created by Catholic monks in the monastery of Saint Jerome before 18th century, and which is extremely popular both in Western Europe and in all former Portuguese colonies. Soccer is the most popular sport in the country. Older Portuguese people still remember the legendary Eusebio, who is still the main symbol of Portuguese football history. The winners of Ballon d'Or for the best player on the planet were Luis Figo and of course the super famous Cristiano Ronaldo. With him at the helm, the Portuguese national team managed to win European Championship in 2016. So who is the greatest player of all the time? Me, that's who. I hope you find this video interesting and of some value for you. Please excuse my Tarzan English and please like, share and subscribe.